I've never told my son that I make $40,000 a month. To him, I'm just a frugal, ordinary mother. That day, he was the one who invited me to have dinner with his in-laws, and I decided to see how he would treat someone who supposedly had nothing. I played the part of a broke, clueless mom. But just a few minutes after I sat down at the table, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're listening from. I sat in my two-bedroom apartment in Chicago, my hand brushing against the worn edge of a leather wallet resting by my elbow. Inside, it was an old employee badge, its corner curled up. Evelyn Carter, Regional Executive Director, Atlantic Tech Group. I was used to glass-walled conference rooms, the shimmer of projectors, 12 pairs of eyes waiting for my decision, long signatures flowing across 7-figure contracts. I made $40,000 a month. Yet here, in this apartment, I was just a woman pouring coffee from a cheap carafe, driving an old Toyota, and doing my own laundry. No designer labels. No yachts. Just peace. After my husband passed away, I stopped talking about work. Ryan was still in high school. What he needed wasn't business lectures. It was hot dinners, dry coats, and a mother who could stay awake through the night. When he asked, "Mom, what do you do at the company?" I simply said, "I work in an office." I tucked my business cards into a drawer so I wouldn't have to explain why his mother was in meetings where other men waited for their turn. I didn't want him growing up believing money was a key that opened every door. I wanted him to know that if there was a door he wanted to open, he should do it with his own strength. Time moved fast. Ryan's 32 now, a financial consultant in Boston. He married Madison Hamilton, a rich girl from an old family. I realized the distance between us didn't happen overnight. It was like touching a painted wall and finding dust clinging to your fingers. Only then do you see the color has faded. Ryan called less often, and when he did, every word seemed weighed, measured, as if he were afraid to touch something out of place. I didn't bring it up. When your child becomes an adult, silence sometimes becomes the only way to listen. Tuesday night, the phone rang. The screen said Ryan. I answered. "Mom, this Friday we're having dinner with Madison's parents. I want you to come." "Where?" "The Birchwood. It's kind of fancy." "Mom, just dress simply, okay? I don't want anyone to see you." Uncomfortable. The word uncomfortable caught in my ear like a splinter. I looked at the worn wallet, the old employee badge beside it. My voice sounded calm when I said, "All right, I'll be there." When the call ended, the room filled again with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. "If you want to see your mother poor, I'll show you what that looks like," I said softly. Not a promise, just a plan. And planning was something I'd always been good at. Setting goals, writing scenarios, managing risks. I laid a dress on the bed and pulled from a box an old pair of flats, their heels worn thin. The bag I chose was a canvas tote from the grocery store down the street, rough fabric, curved straps, no logo. I opened a small drawer and ran my fingers over the things that used to define me to others. A fine fountain pen, an old watch, a few project pins. I left them where they were. In the end, I took only one thing from the corner of the drawer, my Amex Centurion card. I looked at it for 3 seconds, just long enough to remember that real power never makes a sound, then slipped it into my wallet, right behind the old badge. My phone buzzed with a text. "Ryan. Thanks, Mom. Don't worry. Everything will be fine." I didn't reply. I walked to my desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a stack of letters I'd never sent. One for Ryan on his graduation day, one for myself after the first time a business partner underestimated me, one for my husband on the night the hospital went dark. I didn't reread them. I just needed to know they were there, words spoken in a safe place. I once thought silence was a reward after a day full of people and noise. Turns out, silence is also a question. What does your child see when he looks at his mother? The Boston night wind brushed the collar of my coat, carrying the salty scent of the bay. The birchwood gleamed like a wall of glass. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The hostess gave a quick glance at my cotton dress. Its color faded, seams visible, but kept her professional smile. "Mrs. Carter, a table for 6. Right this way, please." The table sat by a white brick wall, a wine rack behind it. Ryan and Madison were already there, across from Victoria and Charles Hamilton. The moment I arrived, Victoria smiled a perfect little gap that showed off her flawless enamel. "Oh, Mrs. Evelyn, how simple you look. It's wonderful that someone still keeps the spirit of thrift these days." I pulled out my chair. No one reached to help. Ryan half rose, then sat back down, his eyes avoiding mine. Madison tried to smooth the moment with a soft voice. "I'm glad you made it, Mom. I was worried it'd be too cold tonight." I set my canvas bag by my feet and smiled. "Thank you, honey. I'm fine." The waiter poured water, reciting the day's specials with the kind of elaborate words I'd heard 100 times before. Victoria waved her hand and ordered 2 bottles of red, listing the vineyards like she was naming trophies. Charles set his knife and fork down at a precise 75-degree angle, then looked up. "Madison went to Harvard, and Ryan, where did you go again?" "Ah, state school, wasn't it?" He drew out, "wasn't it?" like dropping anchor on still water. Ryan gave a polite chuckle. "Yes, state school." I took a sip of water, the chill cooling my throat. "State schools have some excellent professors," I said. "People who teach you how to work with others." Charles smirked. "I'm sure they do." Appetizers arrived. Victoria filled the space with short, polished anecdotes, each one carefully chosen to highlight the gap between our families. When the main course came, the air filled with the scent of brown butter and herbs. Victoria took a dainty bite, set her fork down, and leaned in as if to confide. "I've always thought it's not easy for a woman to handle everything alone." She paused half a second, her eyes flicking toward my worn flats. "At this age, one should think about resting, enjoying life. You don't get out much, do you?" I answered evenly. "I take walks every morning." Charles rested an elbow on the table. "In what part of Chicago? South Side? I hear it's quite dangerous, you know. Rough crowd out there." Ryan barely spoke. From my seat, I could see his wrist tighten on the table's edge every time Victoria said the word standards. Under the table, Madison's hand brushed his a small, quick motion. Then Charles laughed lightly. "And what office do you work in, Mrs. Evelyn? I remember Ryan mentioned." Ryan cleared his throat, his words catching. I rescued him. "Just a regular office." Charles murmured an "ah," soft but loaded, the kind that means "I see." I let it pass, letting them place me neatly inside the box they'd built. Dessert arrived, powdered sugar scattered like thin snow. Victoria leaned toward me, lowering her voice half a tone. "Mrs. Evelyn, I understand how hard it is being a single parent. I truly respect that. If you'd like, I could send a small amount each month, just as a bit of help." She added lightly, "Only to make things easier for you. Family is about lifting each other up, isn't it?" Ryan bit his lip. I heard his teeth close tight. Madison stared down at her plate. I set my spoon down without a sound. "Thank you," I said, my tone steady. "Your kindness isn't lacking." I lifted my glass of water, my eyes never leaving hers. In Victoria's pupils, I saw the gleam of self-satisfied certainty, the glow of someone who believes their generosity has landed exactly where it should. "It's just that," I added, "I'm afraid I wouldn't know how to use it." Victoria tilted her head. "What do you mean?" I smiled politely. "I've grown used to living this way. Fewer things to lose, fewer debts to pay." Charles cut in with a dry laugh. "Everyone's got something to lose. Reputation, for instance." He looked at Ryan. "Wouldn't you agree, son?" Ryan said nothing. I turned to him. "You tired, sweetheart?" He shook his head slightly. I understood. It wasn't his body that was tired. Victoria folded her hands. "Honestly, the amount is nothing compared to what we've already done for the kids. The condo deposit, their honeymoon, a few startup expenses, all things we were happy to handle. I'm sure you also want your son to be stable." The waiter appeared and set the check on the table, a brown leather folder tied neatly with a string. Charles reached for it immediately. "Allow me." Ryan jumped in. "Dad, let me." Victoria nudged his arm to stop him. I sat still, feeling time stretch, soft and slow, like dough rising. I didn't object. I never fight in places where winning means nothing. Madison suddenly looked up, meeting her mother's eyes. She spoke quietly, but just loud enough for the table to hear. "Mom, can we please not talk about money tonight?" Victoria hesitated, then smiled, lips tight. "Sweetheart, let me guide the conversation tonight. It's more interesting that way." She turned back to me, her tone gentler now, as if we were two women sharing a private confidence. Don't take me the wrong way, Mrs. Evelyn. I truly want to help. I know what it feels like to be alone. And the humiliation of my family didn't end there. Charles leaned back, his tone casual, like someone testing the elasticity of another person's composure. I think Ryan's very lucky to have a mother who takes such good care of him, even if the circumstances are modest. He swallowed the last word, letting it fall on the table like an old coin. I set my glass down, the soft clink breaking the air, my eyes resting on the wood grain beneath it. Victoria picked up the cue, her voice smooth and practiced, like a seasoned host. Exactly. None of us choose where we're born, but we can choose how we live and what standards we teach our children. She looked at Ryan, then at Madison, and finally let her gaze settle on me. Long enough to measure my size, short enough to pretend it was accidental. I lowered my eyes, letting the silence at the table swallow whatever reply might have risen. Under the table, my left hand gripped the chair's edge, fingertips brushing the cold, polished wood. The napkin under my right hand was flattened to perfection past the point of needing it. In my career, I've sat through more power dinners than I can count from New York to Seattle, but never one that made me feel such contempt. There was no power here, only labels, and the habit of tallying worth. Money makes them believe they're gods. But they don't understand that real power is self-control. I lifted my head, my voice returning to the steady cadence I used in boardrooms. Mrs. Victoria, Mr. Charles, thank you for your kindness. I used the word they liked. But before I accept any sort of assistance, I think I should properly reintroduce myself. I placed my dessert spoon neatly along the rim of my plate, perfectly parallel to the table's edge. The small act of order helped me reclaim my balance. The room seemed to pause for a beat. A piano in the corner drifted through a key change. Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly, the corner of her mouth curving, as if she'd just been handed a curious plot twist. Oh? I let a brief silence linger long enough to hear a waiter set a tray down at the next table. Then I smiled. I don't work in a small office, I said, keeping my eyes steady on each of them. I run one. Charles took a sip of wine, setting the glass down with a faint click. Victoria leaned forward, her gaze sharp, waiting for the next word, as if reading it off a screen. Ryan looked up for the first time that evening. He met my eyes, confusion and disbelief flickering across his face. Madison drew her hands together in front of her chest, fingers laced, waiting. Evelyn Carter, Regional Executive Director, Atlantic Tech Group. I said it as one might confirm a detail over the phone, something both parties already knew. My tone didn't rise or fall. I make $40,000 a month, oversee several states, and I chose to stay quiet about it, because at home, I'm Ryan's mother. And that's enough. I didn't emphasize the number. I didn't list my accomplishments. I simply slid the truth across the table the way one passes a folder to the other side. Charles tilted his head, as if checking whether this was some elaborate joke. Victoria pressed her lips together. Her fingers lifted from the edge of her plate, revealing a jeweled hand that suddenly didn't know where to rest. Ryan exhaled a small, shaky breath, but I heard it, because the entire table had gone silent. I said nothing more. No explanations. No stories of conference rooms. No recitations of contracts signed. No trophies disguised as history. I only held their gaze, watching each face decide what to do with the new information. In boardrooms, this is the moment when I let others determine the value of what I've just put on the table. Here, it was no different. I leaned back against my chair, exhaling slowly, like releasing a button after a long presentation. My part was done, ending the play without lowering the curtain. Truth is its own spotlight. Whoever stands beneath it chooses how to see themselves. I lifted my glass again, letting the cool water smooth my throat. On the table, my old employee badge lay still, its bent corner catching a sliver of light. I set the glass down, the sound crisp and deliberate. Then I looked up, ready whether for their next question or for the silence that would follow. Madison raised a hand to her mouth, whispering soundlessly, "Oh my God." She didn't take her eyes off me, but her knees drew closer together in instinct, like someone straightening up to keep their balance. Victoria smiled, enamel tight. I had no idea. There's no need to apologize, I interrupted, my voice as gentle as placing another spoon on a tablecloth. I just want us to be honest with each other. You have every right to be proud of your money, And so do I, only I chose silence. I drew my business card back toward me, not putting it away, just leaving it there like a mirror. On the polished wood, its white edge reflected the grain, making everything seem straighter for having a boundary. The piano changed key, and the dining room seemed to contract. Charles cleared his throat, regaining the posture of someone who needed to stay in control. Well, congratulations then, but I don't think this has much to do with tonight. He reached for the leather bill folder the waiter had just set down. Allow me, Ryan startled. Dad, let me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Victoria's hand touch her husband's elbow, a small but sharp cue. Stay in character. Charles pulled out his card, holding it at an angle so the light caught it. The waiter bowed slightly and took it to the scanner near the bar. He returned a moment later, stopping a polite step from the table, voice lowered with professional calm. Sir, I'm sorry, your card was declined. It may be a verification issue since it's an out-of-state transaction. Would you like me to try again? The word declined landed on the table without a sound, but it fractured something in the air. Charles frowned. That's impossible. Try again. The waiter nodded and turned away. Victoria lifted her glass, then set it down before it reached her lips. Ryan rubbed an invisible mark along the table's edge. Madison glanced at her parents, then at me, and gave the smallest shake of her head. The waiter returned a second time. I'm very sorry, sir. It's still being declined. It could be a temporary bank hold for security reasons. If you'd like, I can call the manager. That won't be necessary, I said, still looking at Victoria, not him. I opened my wallet and slid out the Amex Centurion card between two fingers, the cool metal pressing into my skin. Allow me. After all, I'd like to remember this evening as a valuable lesson. I handed the card to the waiter. His eyes flickered just a quick, involuntary recognition of something rare. He bowed. Yes, ma'am. A dozen steps later, the scanner gave a short, sharp beep. The sound wasn't louder than the piano, but it ended the entire performance. Charles leaned back, jaw tight. Victoria pressed her fingers to her temple, searching for a new expression to wear. Ryan exhaled, as if breaking the surface after too long underwater. Madison blinked and let go of the chair's armrest. I retrieved the card, slipped it into my wallet, the motion as precise as closing a file folder. Thank you for dinner, I said, turning to the waiter who had just set the scanner back on his tray. The restaurant service is excellent, he smiled, light as a footstep. I stood, meeting Victoria's gaze head on. Money can buy watches, cars, even admiration, but not character. Tonight, you reminded me of that more clearly than ever. I didn't wait for an answer. Words like that need air to travel on their own. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her smile couldn't find its footing. Charles turned the unfinished glass of wine in his hand. Ryan stood halfway, instinctively, but I touched his arm, holding him for half a second. When you're grown enough, I said, looking him straight in the eye, you'll understand that what I did tonight wasn't to humiliate anyone. It was to teach you never to feel ashamed of where you come from. Ryan swallowed hard. His face flushed, then softened like a wave breaking and pulling back into itself. Madison reached out and brushed my arm, a touch so light it felt like an unspoken apology. Thank you, Mom, she said, the honesty in her voice surprising even her. I nodded, saying nothing more. I hadn't come here for gratitude. I'd come to hold up a mirror. I walked out of the golden light of the birchwood, through the lobby where a tall mirror hung at eye level. It reflected a woman with silver in her hair, a cotton dress, a canvas bag, and a calm stride. No crown, just the quiet dignity of standing tall. The door opened, and the Boston wind slipped down my collar. I paused for half a second, listening as the piano faded behind me, then stepped forward. Behind me, 4 faces sat frozen like statues, each one facing their own reflection. Each one confronting the truth that no card can buy. Morning in Chicago opened with a thin shaft of sunlight filtering through the blinds, painting the wooden floor in calm, golden stripes, steady as breathing. I turned on the kettle. The smell of dark roasted coffee rose clean, grounding. The window was slightly open, letting in the sounds of traffic below, mingling with the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain. I hadn't begun to think about Boston yet. My mind still drifted between 2 points, the truth that had been laid on the table and the silence that followed once it was seen. The doorbell rang twice, short and sharp. I set my cup on the counter and went to answer it. Ryan stood in the hallway, holding a bouquet of tulips wrapped in newspaper, dark circles under his eyes. He spoke softly, just one sentence. "Mom, I need to talk." I stepped aside. "Come in." He placed the flowers on the kitchen table, fumbling for a vase. I pulled out a glass one, poured in water, and arranged the stems so the petals wouldn't bruise. Ryan stood there with his hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped like a man finally setting something down. I handed him the second cup of coffee. "Sit," I said. We sat across from each other at the small dining table. Outside, the light receded another notch. Ryan stared at his hands, his nails scraped lightly against each other, opened, then closed again. "I've been ashamed of you," he said, voice rough from lack of sleep. "In front of my friends, in front of Madison, I thought you were just a regular office worker. And I let people think that. I let them control the story. I stayed silent. I didn't interrupt. I waited for the words to find their place." He lifted his head halfway, then dropped it again. I asked quietly, "Were you afraid they'd judge me, or afraid they'd judge you?" The question sat between us, calm and unhurried. Ryan was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, there was no detour left in his voice. "Both," he exhaled, "but mostly me. I was scared of being seen as ordinary, even though I know how stupid that sounds. I was afraid of losing my place in the rooms I'd just learned to enter. I chose the easy way, letting you stay at the edge, so I could stand in the middle." I listened, feeling my throat go dry for a moment, then warm again. "I don't need you to protect me," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "I need you to respect me. And those are two very different things." Ryan blinked. I could see that sentence pass across his face like a drifting cloud, then settle deep. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly. "Last night, I sat there and let them put you in a box. I told myself I was avoiding conflict. But really, I was. Letting them pollute the air and pretending it was perfume." He gave a crooked, self-mocking smile. "I thought I was being mature by staying silent. Turns out, I was just being convenient." I slid a plate with 2 cookies toward him. He didn't eat, just placed a fingertip on the rim of the plate, as if needing something solid to touch. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, his voice catching for the first time. "I'll talk to Madison's family. I can't let them treat you like that. I have to make it right. You don't need to avenge me," I said softly. "Just stand tall when people look down on you. That's answer enough." I didn't add any lessons. I've learned people only truly absorb what they translate from their own pain. Ryan nodded, this time with more strength. "I'll talk to them today," he said. "No more help in exchange for silence. No more sarcasm. No more conditions placed on you. There's no standard that justifies disrespect." He inhaled deeply, like someone about to dive into cold water. "And I'll tell Madison that I need her to stand with me, not behind her mother. If she can't, then we'll learn how until she can." I looked at my son, really looked, and for the first time, I saw a conviction in him larger than his fear. "Good," I said. "But remember, keep it short. Long sentences lose direction." He laughed, unexpectedly, the tension breaking like foam on coffee. "You're still you," he said, "always editing for clarity." We sat in silence for a while. The cars outside moved in a rhythm, like distant rain. Ryan touched the vase, adjusting a tulip that leaned too far to one side. "Can I ask you something?" he said hesitantly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? About everything?" I set my cup down. The faint clink of ceramic on wood sounded small and final. "Because I wanted you to walk on your own feet," I said. "If I'd told you, it would have been too easy to lean. And secrets. Sometimes they're a test to see what a person truly values. I didn't keep it from you to make you smaller. I kept it so you'd have a chance to grow." Ryan exhaled, his shoulders loosening. "I get it now," he said, without resistance. "I used to think I'd feel proud if I knew how successful you were. But now I know some things you have to touch yourself before you understand their shape." He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. "I was wrong in Boston," he said, not turning around. "I forgot that you never needed saving. You just needed to know that I was ashamed of the right things." I stood beside him, both of us watching the traffic drift by. "Shame's a good signal," I said. "It tells decent people when to stop." Ryan laughed this time, for real. Then he turned and hugged me, firm and quiet. I patted his back twice and let go. "Go on," I said. But whatever you do, make sure you eat well and take care of yourself. He nodded, picking up his coat. Before opening the door, he stopped. Mom, he said, eyes brighter now. Thank you for letting me see for myself. I answered. The eyes don't remember what they don't see. You've seen. The door closed. His footsteps faded down the hall. I stood for a moment, listening as silence returned to its place. The tulips in the vase leaned toward the light, petals opening a little wider. I cleared the 2 cups, washed them, set them upside down on the rack, the sound of porcelain touching porcelain, clean and crisp. I sat back at the table, looking at the worn wallet in the corner. The metal card inside was still there, silent as testimony. I didn't feel triumphant. In business, a decision made at the right moment brings advantage. In family, a decision made at the right moment can pull a relationship back from the edge words can't reach. Last night, I put the truth on the table so everyone could see themselves. This morning, my son knocked on the door to see where he stood. The front of the Hamilton estate stood still, its tall windows like half-closed eyes. Ryan stopped at the steps and took a deep breath. Madison squeezed his hand but said nothing. The doorbell rang a short, single note. The butler opened the door, stepped aside, and gestured them in with a well-rehearsed nod. The living room was wide and bright, everything placed with precision, not a single crease out of line. Victoria poured tea from a silver pot, steam rising in a thin trail. Charles sat deep in an armchair, his eyes scanning them like he was counting assets. Ryan placed his coat over the armrest, stood straight, and began calmly. Last night at the Birchwood, I let things go too far. I'm here to make it clear I won't accept my mother being demeaned in any story connected to this family. Victoria slid a teacup toward Madison, smiling politely, the kind of smile worn like jewelry. I understand, dear. I was only concerned. Everything I said was meant to protect the family's reputation. Charles nodded, in rhythm with her tone. Standards do matter, Ryan. You know that better than anyone. We just want what's best for both of you. Ryan didn't sit. He stood in the center of the rug, as if drawing a circle around himself to keep from being pulled off balance. I don't object to standards, he said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. I object to using standards as a weapon to belittle others, especially my mother. The air shifted. From the kitchen came the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, then silence. Victoria set her cup down, keeping her fingers on the handle, her voice softening like syrup. Ryan, your father and I have done a lot to help you both start out. A bit of guidance, a bit of support. Surely that's not wrong, Ryan answered plainly. Helping is good, but subsidizing in exchange for distance or control isn't. Charles gave a short laugh, tilting his head. You're being oversensitive. Maturity means knowing when to accept help. Ryan looked directly at him. Maturity means standing on your own and saying no when help comes with the price of humiliating your mother. Victoria's eyes flickered. She turned to Madison. Sweetheart, say something. I don't think you want to turn your back on your family. Madison didn't look down. She set her purse beside the chair, straightened her back, and spoke clearly. I agree with Ryan. A pause. Mrs. Evelyn was disrespected last night. I stayed quiet for too long. I won't do it again. Charles leaned back, arms crossed, keeping his smile steady. Madison, you're letting emotions lead you. In your mother's position, anyone would. I'm speaking from my own position. She interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. Ryan took a half step forward, raising one hand as if writing in the air, counting each point. Our boundaries are threefold. 1. No sarcasm or disrespect toward my mother, direct or implied. 2. No financial assistance in exchange for silence, distance, or control. 3. Respect our financial independence, Madison, and I will live by our own means. He lowered his hand. That's all. Victoria placed a hand over her chest, switching swiftly into the tone of misunderstood concern. I've been taken the wrong way. I was just worried. A woman her age, living alone, I thought. Ryan shook his head. No, that's not worry. That's condescension. He spoke slower now, each word landing clear. You called my mother a burden. You offered to send her money in exchange for her absence. That's not concern. Charles exhaled, adopting the firm cadence of a man used to closing meetings. All right, let's be direct. This family has assets, trusts, arrangements. You're both part of that. But it comes with responsibility to maintain the family image. We're all in the same boat. Ryan didn't flinch. That's your choice. Our choice is to respect both families without trading dignity for a seat on the boat. Victoria looked at her son-in-law, then turned to her daughter, her tone darkening. Do you even realize what you're saying? You're stepping outside the family's embrace. Madison swallowed, but her voice held steady. I know. And if that embrace starts to choke, I need to loosen it. Her hand rested on her knee, fingers relaxed. I want to be close to you, Mom, but not at the cost of looking down on anyone else. A silence stretched. The clock ticked, each second falling like a drop of water into a metal basin. The butler passed through, setting a tray of cookies on the side table before slipping quietly away. No one reached for them. Charles leaned back further, changing tactics. If you two don't need financial support, fine. But don't come asking when things get hard. The world isn't as kind as you think, Ryan replied evenly. We're not asking, and we're not selling either. He paused, his voice softening. I didn't come here to win. I came so we can have dinner one day without measuring each other's worth in dollars. Victoria exhaled, her eyes shining slightly. She offered her last line like throwing a life preserver. I've spent my life climbing. I know what falling feels like. I just don't want that for you. Madison met her gaze and pushed the lifeline gently back onto the table. I'm not selling my peace for money. The words landed on the thick carpet but still echoed. Charles shifted, half rising, then sitting again like a man hesitating at a line he wasn't sure he should cross. He spoke slowly, his tone mixing duty with warning. We'll have to revisit some of our arrangements. Ryan nodded. That's your choice. But from today on, our home is ours to arrange. Victoria blinked, her lashes trembling once. She turned away, dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, and said, voice lowered a half step, if that's what you both want, I won't stop you. Then, almost under her breath, but it hurts. Madison stood, walked around the small table, and stopped beside her mother. She didn't hug her, just rested a hand on her shoulder. I'm hurt too, she said softly, but pain isn't a reason to do the wrong thing. Ryan slipped on his coat. He nodded once toward Charles, a quiet farewell. We'll go now. When you're ready for dinners that aren't about money or standards, call us. He opened the door for Madison. She paused at the threshold, turned back to her mother. I hope one day we can talk about a good book, a new tree we planted, or a cheap trip that made us laugh. Not about who's worth more. And with that, she stepped out. Midday in Chicago, bright sun, but the wind still cold. I heard 3 steady knocks on the door. When I opened it, Madison was standing on the porch in a gray crewneck sweater and dark jeans, her face bare of makeup. She gave a brief, slightly awkward smile. I had a half-day meeting nearby. I hope it's all right if I stop by, if you have time. I stepped aside. Come in. The apartment looked the same as always. A small wooden table, the vase of tulips fully bloomed, the kitchen tidy. Madison set her purse on a chair and turned an empty cup slowly in her hands. I wanted to come alone, she said evenly. No Ryan, no my parents. I poured her a glass of water, set it down, and sat across from her. Go ahead. She glanced around the room once, then began, her voice measured. I grew up in long hallways that smelled of polished wood. From the time I was little, I learned to keep my shoulders straight, to hold a fork and knife at the proper angle, to say thank you before asking for what I wanted. Private schools, horseback clubs, summer camps in Maine, everything had a standard, even how to smile for the camera. Madison gave a short laugh, one without joy. I was good at following rules, and lazy about asking questions, because every time I asked, someone would say, don't make it harder than it is, this is the best way. She paused, her fingertip tracing the rim of the cup. That night at the Birchwood, when you placed your business card on the table, it felt like someone flipped on a light in the room. Not because I learned who you were, but because, for the first time, I saw myself clearly in the mirror. I didn't say anything to defend you. I just sat there like when I was little, standing on the marble steps waiting for the car, not allowed to run. She looked up at me. I'm sorry. I didn't push her apology away or draw it closer. I simply nodded, letting it sit where it belonged. Madison exhaled, the weight easing slightly from her shoulders. The next morning, Ryan and I spoke with my parents, she continued, but I wanted to talk to you for a different reason. I'm scared. She smiled faintly, unflinching. I'm scared that if I take Hamilton off my name, There'll be nothing left. I'm scared of the emptiness. I asked the question the way one places a pin on a map. What do you want your life to be? Madison tilted her head, thinking. To not be measured by a price tag, she said slowly. To choose friends for who they are, not for who's on the guest list. I want evenings that are simple but don't feel lacking. I want to talk to my parents without starting with a charity certificate. I nodded. If you remove the Hamilton label, what remains? She was quiet for a few seconds, then said, I listen well. I work carefully. I don't lie to make myself look better. And I know how to admit when I'm wrong. She shrugged slightly. Maybe that's enough to start with. I didn't lecture. I opened the drawer, took out a blank sheet of paper, wrote 4 lines, and slid it toward her. This is a framework for rebuilding, I said. Not because I know better, but because, over a long road, these 4 points keep you from getting lost. She read, values, respect, honesty, kindness, boundaries. State clearly what you accept and what you don't. Responsibility. Pay your own way. Make your own choices. Own your outcomes. Truth. Speak up when you're hurt, but do it calmly. Starting today, she said slowly, as if signing a document, I'll step back from the habit of showing off. I won't post what doesn't matter. I'll manage my own expenses, open an account I control, no more automatic top-ups from home. I'll plan my career by ability, not by image. She looked up. I know I'll stumble, but I want to walk. I asked, what about Ryan? He'll walk with me, she said. Outside the window, sunlight slanted across the roof of the building opposite, landing on the table in a hand-sized patch of gold. Madison noticed it, frowning slightly, as if filing the detail away. I'll make my evening train, she said. Tonight I'll talk to my mother again. This time I won't ask permission to be myself. I'll just be myself. The door closed softly behind her. I stood for a moment, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. On the table, the tulips leaned slightly. One petal had fallen. I picked it up and laid it beside the stem. 2 women had just sat together, not making grand promises, not speaking in polished lines. We held hands, then set down 4 sentences that were enough to live by. The rest is the road, and the road doesn't listen to speeches, it only accepts footsteps. Ryan and Madison's new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a red brick building overlooking a quiet street. White walls, an old wooden dining table, mismatched chairs, a makeshift bookshelf made of pine planks. I arrived in the late afternoon. The smell of fresh paint still lingered faintly, mingling with the scent of toasted bread drifting in from the neighboring unit. On the wall hung a small rope board with notes: rent, utilities, groceries, transportation, emergency fund. Next to it were a marker and neat little check marks. Ryan pointed to the bottom right corner. Every month, we set a bit aside for emergencies. Madison added, not much, but enough to keep us from panicking. We had dinner, pasta, and salad. Ryan talked about his company pushing hard to land a major client with the deadline closing in. Madison mentioned the case file she was handling, how some colleagues still looked at her through the lens of her Hamilton name. I let them talk, watching how they chose their words. Short, clear, without blame. On the table, between their plates, lay a paper titled, Priorities for the Week. Get enough sleep, exercise twice, 1 dinner with no talk about money. I nodded. Learning to prioritize is one of life's hardest skills, but after hardship, people start to understand the difference between what they need and what they merely want. The pull of the past doesn't knock before entering. The next evening, an old friend invited Madison to a charity gala. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Pictures of dresses, guest lists, names of high-profile sponsors. Social media resurfaced old memories, photos of her on red carpets under flashes. Madison stared at the screen, her finger hovering over attend. Ryan stood in the kitchen, ladle in hand, saying nothing. I watched the thin, invisible string stretch from her phone to both their shoulders. You can go, Ryan said first, pouring soup into bowls. I just don't want us slipping back into the old rhythm. Madison leaned against the counter. Going or not doesn't define who I am. She flipped over the priorities list and added 1 line. Boundaries. Attend events only if they truly matter. At 9, Ryan took a work call. After a few sentences, his voice dropped. An important contract was stuck. This month's income would likely dip. He hung up, leaned against the wall, and looked at the expense board. If this month's short, the emergency fund covers about 3 weeks, he said without complaint. Madison placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we cut restaurants, keep rent, and protect what keeps us sane. They debated for 10 minutes, living simply or turning a blind eye to opportunity, and ended with an agreement. Any big decision would be discussed twice, one day apart, before being finalized. I stayed one more night in Boston. The next meal was simpler roasted chicken, potatoes, greens. I asked just 3 questions, no more. Are you two getting enough sleep? Ryan, 6 hours last night. We'll catch up on the weekend. Do you have a dinner just to talk? Not about money? Madison, Sunday. When you disagree, who apologizes first? They glanced at each other. Then Ryan raised his hand. Whoever realizes they're wrong, I nodded. That was enough. No lectures, no oversight. Before leaving, I wrote in the corner of their noteboard, "Keep your back straight." The next day, Madison texted me a photo of a handwritten letter. Cream-colored paper, neat handwriting. Is greater than, Mom and Dad, I love you both. But I'm tired of every meal turning into a performance review. Is greater than I want to see you without showing off, without sarcasm, without conditions. Is greater than I know you've done many good things for us, but I can't accept assistance that demands silence in return. Is greater than. If you're ready to listen, let's meet next week at a simple restaurant and talk about life. It is greater than. If not, I'll wait. I'm not angry. I'm just keeping boundaries. No guilt, no resentment. She sent it, expecting no quick reply. That afternoon, Ryan called with bad news. The contract had gone to a competitor. He sat quietly for a while, hand at the back of his neck. I heard his sigh through the phone, no frustration, just acknowledgement. All right, he said finally. Then we cut some non-essentials. He marked the expense board again, shifting part of entertainment into emergency fund. After enough hardship, people learn how to steer without capsizing. Madison had her own turbulence. At work, someone whispered, "She's not the Hamilton she used to be." The comment reached her after 3 retellings. She shared it with me in an even voice. "I'm not going to explain myself," she said. "You don't need to," I told her. "Just do your work right." Time writes more accurate headlines than people ever will. That night, she stayed up late editing documents. The next morning, her manager emailed, "Your draft is spotless. Keep writing this way." Some nights, I dropped by and sat quietly by the window. The two of them argued about whether to buy an armchair. Ryan wanted to skip it. Madison wanted it because her back hurt. They settled on a compromise. Buy a used one, clean it thoroughly, add a cushion. It ended with a touch of hands. I looked toward the street and caught our reflection in the glass, 3 people, each holding just enough space in the room. A week later, Madison received a reply to her letter. Victoria had texted a brief message. "I got it. Let's talk when you have time. No apology, no accusation. Just a small opening enough to keep hope alive." Charles stayed silent. I told Madison, "Don't rush. Keep your own pace." On my last night before flying home, we shared cheap pizza from the corner shop. Ryan revisited an old question. Does living simply make us miss out on opportunity? I said, "The right opportunities don't mind quiet people." Madison smiled. "Then we'll stay quiet." Ryan clinked his soda can against my cup. "Quiet and stand tall." I left Boston early the next morning. Before walking out, I added one more small line beneath the board. Ask before you spend. The apartment was calm, gray light pooling across the floor. Ryan walked me down the stairs. "Mom," he said at the landing, "we're not perfect, but we're not leaving each other halfway." I replied, "Good. I hope you both always keep that spirit." Victoria's email arrived on a drizzly morning, just a few short lines. No warm greeting, no small talk. "Got your letter. Let's talk when there's time." The period at the end felt like a lid sealing a cold box. A week later, Charles called Ryan, his tone steady, like he was reading from an agenda. "I can offer some temporary help, as long as you two show up at a few family events. Keep things proper." Ryan handed the phone to Madison. She spoke slowly, her voice polite to the point of leaving no room for distortion. "We'll come when we feel respected." Then she hung up, no raised tone, no sigh escaping through the receiver. When they told me, I simply nodded. Once boundaries are drawn, they don't need to be painted. Time folded into weeks of busyness. My own projects carried me along, while Boston remained a small red dot on the map. Then came the appointed day, meeting again at the Birchwood. The dining room still smelled of wood and warm butter. The setting was familiar, but we had switched places. I sat in the middle, Ryan on my right, Madison on my left. Across from us were Victoria and Charles. There were no grand openings, no rehearsed pleasantries, just intermittent silences, like a rope cut and tied back too quickly. I spoke first, without circling the point. That evening was a mistake for all of us. The one who spoke the most understood the least. The piano in the background shifted to a deeper chord. Victoria's eyebrows lifted. "You mean me?" She hadn't put her guard down yet. I didn't flinch. "I mean all of us," I said, because I stayed silent too long. The moment I finished, the surface of the table seemed to level out. I wasn't looking to win. I was laying down enough flat ground so we could set things on it without them sliding off. Charles clasped his hands and exhaled. "I may have been too blunt," he said, his voice dry as day, old bread. "I took a loss last month, not a disaster, but enough to lose sleep. And when you can't sleep, you talk too much." His confession left a small pause behind it. Victoria shifted her teacup, staring into it as if into the eye of a needle. "I don't want my daughter to struggle," she said quietly, her voice losing its sharpness. "I know struggle isn't always about money, but money is easier to measure." Ryan nodded, not attacking. "I understand the fear," he said, "but that fear doesn't give you the right to call someone less than you." Madison turned to her mother, her voice gentle, like setting a thin glass on a shelf. "I want to see you and Dad without wearing armor. If every night feels like a parade, we'll grow distant." Victoria looked at her daughter longer than usual, as if trying to find the child once learning to tie her shoes reflected in the woman now sitting across from her. I kept the rhythm steady. "Let's try something simple," I said. "A family gathering where we don't talk about money, just about life. One dinner." Madison followed. "Ask what books we're reading this week, what plants we're growing, where we've been walking. No proving, no comparing." Charles turned his ring, pressing his lips together. After a long pause, he said, "All right, one dinner." Victoria pinched the edge of her napkin, nodded slightly, her eyes cautious like someone walking across thin ice. The meal passed without the usual hidden jabs disguised as compliments. The air wasn't warm yet, but it had lost some of its sharp edges. Charles shared a short story from the golf course, skipping the part about his score. Victoria talked about the new hydrangeas she planted on the porch, lamenting the cold soil. Ryan mentioned fixing a wobbly shelf in their apartment. Madison described her Sunday morning run. I nodded here and there, adding a few small comments to keep the conversation moving. Sometimes silence returned to stand in the middle of the table. We let it stand, and then quietly walked around it. When the check arrived, no one rushed for it. The waiter placed the leather folder in the center and bowed slightly. I reached for it, then paused. "Let's split it evenly," I said, my tone as plain as arithmetic. No one objected. Victoria nodded and took out her card. Charles laid his next to hers. Ryan and Madison followed. The waiter gathered them and walked toward the counter. While we waited, there were no heroes, no losers, just 4 pieces of plastic lying side by side, like fragments of a larger mirror being fitted together for the first time. The sound of the card reader echoed softly, each swipe smooth, no issues. The server returned with 4 receipts, placing one before each of us. I signed mine, heard the crisp tear of the stub. When Victoria lifted her pen from the signature line, she looked up at me, not smiling in triumph, not frowning in defeat, just a small nod. A gesture enough to admit that some lessons aren't taught at galas. We left the restaurant. At the doorway, I rested my hand on the handle for half a second. The glass reflected 3 figures, me in the middle, Ryan and Madison on each side. Behind us, 2 other silhouettes framed in the doorway, Victoria touching her neck, Charles adjusting his cuff. No fireworks, no embraces. Just adults learning to slow down so they wouldn't step on each other's feet. And outside, the rain-soaked street stretched ahead like a new line drawn over an old map. Time moved slowly like the second hand brushing across the kitchen clock. I flew to Boston less often now. Chicago seemed heavier with clouds. Ryan and Madison were finding their rhythm. Simple dinners, weekend walks around the lake, sometimes driving to the countryside to watch the maple woods. I visited one Friday evening, just as they'd finished assembling a used bookshelf they'd bought online. Ryan was tightening the lower screw, Madison steadied the frame. Good? He asked. Hold 3 more seconds, she said. The shelf stood firm. They let go at the same time, in a motion that looked well practiced. On the dining table, pasta, salad, a modest bottle of wine. Madison poured me water, smiling lightly. I've started a new habit, she said. Every night, I write down 3 things I'm grateful for. Today's are a standing bookshelf, dinner not burned, and 8 hours of sleep. Ryan cut in. Not 8, 6.5. She pouted. 6.5 plus a 1-hour nap. I watch them. They're teasing gentle, like 2 people learning how to share the same space. On Sunday, they sent me a photo of a small tent set up in the park near their home. Their weekend camping plan was written on the fridge calendar, no bright colors, but the handwriting was steady and sure. I realized that after a long, difficult stretch, they had learned to move by their own rhythm instead of borrowing someone else's. One late afternoon, my phone rang. The name on the screen, Victoria. I let it ring once more before answering. Her voice had lost the edge it carried in those early dinners. "Thank you for not hating me," she said, straight to the point. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window. "We're all still learning," I said. "Learning how to stand beside one another, not above." There was a short silence on the other end. "I'm trying," she said finally. "I planted a pot of rosemary, but it keeps wilting." I chuckled. "Don't water by schedule, water by soil." She laughed softly too. Not a full apology, but an open door. I didn't need to push. The following week, we all had dinner at Ryan and Madison's apartment. Pasta, salad, crisp toasted bread. Wine poured into ordinary glass tumblers. No flowers, just the scent of rosemary from the windowsill. Ryan talked about a podcast he'd been listening to on deep work habits. Madison showed off her revived rosemary plant, now thriving after she moved it to a sunnier spot. Victoria asked what I was reading, and I mentioned a novel about grown-ups learning forgiveness. Charles avoided the stock market topic and told a story about an old golf buddy who had finally quit smoking. The conversation meandered through small things: how to keep your back straight when lifting, a low-sodium tomato sauce recipe, a hidden camping trail by the lake. No one mentioned standards, and no one measured each other by money. Madison set the pot of pasta on a wooden trivet. "I'm trying not to use social media after 8 p.m., she said. "It's harder than I thought, but I sleep better," Ryan added. "I turn off email after 9. If it's urgent, they'll call." Victoria looked at them, nodding slowly. "I just unfollowed a few accounts that made me tired," she said carefully. "I think I need some quiet." I raised my glass of water. Silence is good as long as it's not a wall. The meal went slowly, but without dragging. Charles asked for more salad. Ryan stood to slice bread. Madison drizzled olive oil over the bowls. Victoria adjusted the salt shaker's place. "Planning to plant anything else?" she asked. Madison smiled. "Time, if it survives." Charles cleared his throat and looked at me. "I've realized," he said, "talking less about money doesn't make dinner less valuable." I squinted, smiling. "Exactly. It gives it flavor." He laughed genuinely, not forced. After dinner, Ryan washed the dishes. Madison rinsed. Victoria and I wiped the table, hung the towels to dry. Sometimes we stood side by side without filling the air with words. Those silences used to make her uneasy. Now, they had become breathing spaces. Before leaving, Victoria turned to me. "Thank you for waiting for us," she said. I replied, "People falling out of sync is normal. Catching up, that's the hard part." She nodded, this time not looking away too quickly. That night, an email arrived: quarterly report, project done on time, all numbers solid enough for a good night's sleep. I didn't smile because of the figures. I smiled because I knew that tomorrow I wouldn't need to rearrange anyone's schedule or teach anyone where to stand in a photo. I closed the laptop and slid it into the drawer. Before bed, I opened the window. In Boston, the apartment window of Ryan and Madison glowed warm in their own night, in another time zone. I pictured them washing dishes, talking and laughing, soap bubbles glinting on their wrists, water running steadily, one plate, then another. They moved through small tasks like climbing short steps, no skipping, no rushing. In Chicago, I turned off the kitchen light and ran my hand along the worn wooden counter, feeling the texture of things that remain, rough, sturdy, and warm when touched. My phone lit up with a message from Madison, a photo of 3 handwritten lines in her small notebook. Grateful for, dinner on time, mom asking about books, Rosemary alive. I replied with an exclamation mark, then added, keep your back straight. She sent back a sketch of a spine, a single pencil line, simple and straight. I went to my room and drew the curtain halfway. The city was still noisy, but some kinds of noise are just background, like air conditioning and passing cars. I lay down, feeling my heartbeat steady, not faster or slower for any victory. I knew, if I ever needed to, the metal card was still in my wallet, like a blade hidden under velvet. But it was better not to use it. Somewhere across the map, a pot of rosemary was learning to take the Sunday. Here, a bookshelf stood steady. I repeated in my head the line I wanted to leave for myself, a quiet reminder. True wealth isn't in balance sheets. It's in the way one walks through a room without making others smaller just to feel bigger. I turned on my side, pulled the blanket to my shoulders, and let the right kind of quiet settle over the corners of the bed. Real wealth is peace, boundaries, and the people who stay because of love. Everything else is just noise. The story you just heard is fictional, but every glance, every swallowed word, every card laid on the table reflects a truth that isn't easy to face. Sometimes, to save your own dignity and the dignity of those you love, you have to let the mask fall, right in the middle of the bright, glittering party. Not for revenge, but to restore order, the order of respect, of boundaries, of the way people look at one another when money and status are no longer standing in between. Names and details have been changed to protect the identities of those who might be recognized. We don't tell this story to glorify pride, but to remind you that sometimes silence itself is a kind of strength, the strength of someone who knows exactly who they are and doesn't need anyone else to prove it for them. If you've ever been looked down on for not being enough, if you've ever swallowed your anger just to keep a relationship from breaking, remember this: calm is not weakness. It is the power of someone who no longer fears losing. Leave a comment if you've ever had to choose between keeping your image and keeping your dignity. And if you believe that self-respect doesn't need to be loud, it only needs to stand tall, share this video. Because somewhere out there, someone might be waiting for a reason to rise, to say enough once in their life. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is a cold but necessary stitch. Stitching back character, mending trust, and teaching the heart how to be silent and still be strong. On the final screen, we'll share 2 more stories about people who seemed defeated, yet won in the only way that truly matters, by keeping their dignity and the quiet peace within their hearts. Trust me, you won't just watch. You'll see yourself in the reflection of that mirror.